No dramatic entrance. I'm just here. All right. So I was waiting for this for a long time, but we're here just kind of nonchalantly, uh, unceremoniously, uncinematically. It's the 50 subscriber special. So, woo, I made 50 subscribers. Thank you all for your love and support. Great, fama jamming. What we're going to do today is I want to talk about why the books of the Bible would make great MCU style crossover movies where everything's connected in one cinematic universe. Since the Bible's one big story written by God, obviously transcends human ability to tell a story so succinctly, so great. And it sticks the landing, unlike the MCU. So we're going to talk about why those books make such great overarching stories, and maybe poke a little fun at some of the cameos that will show up. So I have notes. Let's just run through this and talk about the books of the Bible, and how they do, and if I want to see a movie based on those books. All right, so starting in Genesis, kind of the most important book, pivotal for the entire story. Basically, it'd be like an entire phase one. You have 50 chapters, so you have a lot of content. You have a creation movie with Adam, maybe all the way to the birth of Abel, right? You go through creation, fall, the proto-evangelium, like why all of this matters, what is going to happen. You know, you have hints of the future. Cain murdering his brother. And then, did I say the birth of Abel? I meant the birth of Seth, obviously, because after Abel is killed, Seth is born. Maybe you have that first movie go like all the way up to Noah, right? And then it's like, ooh, you could have a post-credit scene of like it raining or something. Noah could get like a whole series. You could have like a 3-part movie about Noah and like what life is like for Noah and why he started to build a big boat. There actually is a book series kind of in that vein. I'll put it right here because whatever. Thank you, editor Bill. We could find out Noah, like, you know, loves to build things and it's like, oh, I just love building. Ooh. And then he could learn to build a boat. And, you know, that could be like his character arc. There could be movies about Abraham after that, and then Isaac, Jacob, Esau, you know, the whole family line just go down through as God's working the promise out. All of that could culminate in a movie about Joseph being betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery in Egypt, and then turning around and forgiving them in the end. Like, pure cinema, right? So that's Genesis. Basically the basis of the whole story. All right, so let's go to Exodus. The 10 Commandments, the Charlton Heston movie, exists, so that pretty much makes my argument for me. Don't even have to talk about Exodus. It would be great. Get somebody to play Charlton Heston. Awesome. Leviticus. I know people say this is probably a hard book to read, but it's really interesting, actually, if you actually get into it, and then you appreciate why, like, the law is unkeepable and why we need a Messiah. That being said, it would make a terrible movie. Numbers would be okay as a movie. There actually is stuff to do in a Numbers movie, but it would probably just be like part of a Moses film, right? Like maybe for Exodus we have just a Moses film, and then Numbers is like the third act or something. Deuteronomy I think would be funny if it was like a PlayStation style remaster of Leviticus, like definitive edition Leviticus, and it's just like exactly the same because everybody loved Leviticus the first time around. Okay, we got the Pentateuch out of the way. Then we get into Joshua. Joshua is like the Avengers of this beginning of the Bible. It's like everybody's been waiting for this for 40 years. We've been wandering around the wilderness. We're finally going to go into the promised land. Joshua sends spies to Jericho. Rahab hides them. They have to flee, but they make a promise to come back after the family. Then shenanigans with walking around the wall a bunch of times. Then epic battle. There's this Lego movie actually made by some homeschoolers that basically that's just what I want to do, but 3 hours long. Important cameo. The actor for God needs to show up and talk to Joshua in the wilderness. I don't think we've talked about this yet, but the actor for God will need to be the same person the whole series. It's kind of like the Bible's Wit character, or Hoyd character, and the angel of the Lord appears many times. The theophanies throughout the Old Testament. We will we will need to have this character also play Jesus in the New Testament, and we will explain later why. But basically, for Joshua, he needs to come talk to Joshua about what he's going to do, tearing down the wall, and he'll show up in other parts. He will have scars on his hand in the Bill Cinematic Bible universe. He has scars on his hand. Again, we'll explain that later, but I think that's very important for these theophanies that are actually Christophanies. The Joshua movie, very important, very important. Joshua movie ends with Joshua looking at a map of Israel. He sees all the cities of the Canaanites, and there's a ton of them. It's like, whoa, how are we going to conquer them all? And then he crosses off Jericho, and Joshua says, one down. And then Linkin Park plays. After Joshua, we get to Judges. This is where we kind of take a little bit of a detour, and we'll make a TV show instead. Just probably because Judges would probably only work like one-off hour-long episodes, just because each judge doesn't have too much to do, and it can be very like episodic, which is kind of how it feels. One season of TV, one episode for each judge. Maybe some judges get a few more if it's important, right? First episodes are slow, like you just have left-handed people killing fat people. So then it picks up when the scaredy cat man dreams of rolling sweet rolls into the Midians. That'll be a pretty good episode. All right, Ruth. Ruth is actually super important to the overall narrative, like the MCU, like the cinematic universe narrative, because Boaz, who marries Ruth, will be the father to Obed, and Obed is the father to Jesse, and Jesse is the father to King David. So again, in credit style scene, it's like, whoa, Obed is born, and then it kind of like goes from there, right? 1 Samuel. Okay, so 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, the Kings. This is kind of where I really got inspired to do this, because I think the era of like Saul, David, Solomon, all would work really well as movies or TV, and it would be very interesting even without the necessary like biblical context. It would be like, oh, this is a very interesting story about kings, but on top of that, you get the layer of actually they need to do what is right in the Lord's eyes. So 1 Samuel, we do the books of Samuel, probably Kings and Chronicles. Well, the overlapping parts of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Chronicles. There's a little bit of a complication of how they overlap. They don't exactly perfectly overlap, but you do all of that, kind of like the Gospels, how they overlap. But you do all that as like maybe a King Saul movie, right? And you have a movie about Saul and how he's a good king until he's not. But then followed by a trilogy about David, and that's kind of the meat of what we want, right? We got maybe Shepherd Boy David, and then we have a second one where it's like David on the run from Saul, and then the third one about David being king, or maybe the third one is like he finally becomes king, and it's like a triumphant, and then we have more movies about David as king and stuff that happens there. So that's kind of the 1 Samuel. That also incorporates 2 Samuel. 1 Kings, this is where it kind of gets messy, because then after Solomon's dead, you have the kingdom dividing, and then you have all sorts of different kings. But that's where you kind of get like the Game of Thrones-esque political intrigue, which may be actually very interesting and may make for really good TV. Again, just like Judges, it may be like one-off episodes for a king, but then there are going to be really great episodes later when you have Elijah. And so then you can have like an Elijah movie, maybe, with him and his showdown with the prophets of Baal, and then him versus Ahab and Jezebel, and all of that. And then, maybe a spin-off Elisha movie, right? We haven't gotten to it yet just because I'm going in order of the books of the Bible, but a lot of the prophets mix in here, and so they would make good cameos or good spin-offs for these kind of different episodes and movies. But Second Chronicles is very important because after Elijah, Elisha, all of that, like Ahab, Jezebel, Jehu, Joshua, Hezekiah, Manasseh, ultimately it all culminates in captivity, right? So the 10 tribes have been pretty much completely wiped out, taken into captivity by Assyria, and then Judah is taken into captivity by Babylon. And so then that's a great cliffhanger, because now it's like, well, this whole thing we've been building up, this whole nation of Israel, now what happens? It's gone. Okay, then we lead into Ezra. So Ezra and Nehemiah, I feel like there's no way you possibly do that without doing like an Ezra-Nehemiah combo movie. Maybe you have like one Ezra movie, and then maybe you have one Nehemiah movie, and then a team-up movie, and it's got to be called Ezra and Nehemiah because it just works so well as a title, Ezra and Nehemiah. And so Nehemiah, like I said, see above, Ezra and Nehemiah team-up movie. I personally like Nehemiah a lot. Building the wall and all of that, and like serving the foreign king, and then but like I love my homeland, and I gotta go rebuild my city's walls. So that would be a great movie. Finally, Esther. Not super sure how to add that into the continuity. It's like an Ant-Man movie, kind of like it's great and it's awesome, but it doesn't necessarily connect with the others. But it's a great little movie to show, God's providence even in captivity during that time, and in a foreign land, right? Great movie, but it's going to be like one-off, which may be actually a strength of it. All right, so now that's kind of the books, the history books. Then we get into kind of the more complications, because now we have more of the poetry books, and then we'll get into the prophets. So Job, first of all. Job is actually a really good one. I don't really have any idea where to put this in the timeline, because like if we did it chronologically, it would come first. It would be the first movie. However, it's the kind of prequel where if you put it in there, it like spoils the rest of stuff. But it's super baller movie, right? So you do like Wonderful Life-esque moment at the beginning with like Satan and God. Satan comes to God and he's like, yeah, I've just been hanging out. And God's like, oh, well, did you check out Job? He's super awesome. And Satan's like, well, yeah, I bet it's just because you bless him. And then God's like, okay, we'll test him. And then Satan does do some terrible things to him, and Job still, follows God and worships God. And there's some stuff that we can do, and he has talks with his friends that might, drag down the movie maybe. But at the end, we get back to God coming to talk to Job and bringing him really heavy-duty theology and a talk, like man, God to man, literally. But that can be the climactic third act that just hits you really hard. There are a few things in here that, like I said, maybe spoiler or refer to future things. For instance, when Job says, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and he shall stand the later, in the later days upon the earth, reference to that Christ will come in the flesh. There's also a reference to Armageddon when God talks about, hast thou entered into the treasures of snow? Hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? Someone sees a vision of like the in-game stuff. It's like God's like, hey, by the way, have you seen my weapons of mass destruction that I have laid up for the day of battle, right? So stuff like that can be sprinkled in to really drive home the overarching cinematicness of this universe. But 10 out of 10, I think, for Job. I mean, God talks about dinosaurs at the end of Job, so that's going to be awesome. Psalms is going to be hard. It's very big, and there's a lot of Psalms, but I do think that it can be masterfully weaved in during pivotal moments of other movies. say like during some of their writers' lives. David writes a lot of them, so there could be a lot of them in a David movie or a David trilogy. There could, you have Moses' one when after they part the Red Sea. So there's a lot of options to put Psalms in there. So it probably won't work on its own, but it would be great to just sprinkle them in throughout. Same thing with Proverbs, but it's only for Solomon. Proverbs 30 is especially important for the overarching story because there's a verse where he talks about what is God's name and what is his son's name. So it's like, oh, God has a son, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We're getting closer to the gospel. And Proverbs 31 is there. So it will help the female viewership. So, right. Cool. Ecclesiastes, I'll just mention quickly, it's like a filler episode of the Solomon Show. Like, we can have this wacky episode where Solomon's like the preacher and he's talking about how meaningless life is, but then at the end he realizes like, oh, actually remember your creator, it's actually life's worth living. Okay, Song of Solomon is like the April Fool's parody episode. It is not rated. Hide your kids. But it's not. We don't. I mean, we should take it seriously. It's a book of the Bible. It says some really great stuff. But it would be a difficult book to display on the screen. All right, then we get into the major prophets. So Isaiah. Isaiah is great. It's got great crossover with other books. You might not need to make Isaiah into its own movie. Maybe you could. But he will show up with like Hezekiah and other kings, during that time of the split kingdom. But he's super important to get in there somewhere. And he's big enough to make his own movie, but it is cool if he's like a cameo in other movies, even if he does have his own movie. Okay, Jeremiah. I don't think Jeremiah really works as a standalone. But again, he would probably fit in to someone else's movie, maybe like an end movie about the end of the kingdom of Judah. I do think there's a lot of important verses and stuff in Jeremiah that we need to have be displayed. And the scene of Jeremiah in like a miry pit and then being hauled out of a miry pit is probably very important to have. So that needs to be there somewhere. But I don't know if we can get a whole movie out of it. Also, I can never get this Twitter post out of my head whenever I think of Jeremiah and like worship of gods in Israel, because he's the weeping prophet, and that's what would make Jeremiah weep. So I'll leave that for you. Everyone can enjoy that. Lamentations is kind of lumped in with Jeremiah, but then Ezekiel. Ezekiel will be hard to tie into other movies, but it would make actually a very awesome prologue for Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezekiel can come and show like the prophecies about judgment and prophecies about coming back, and that can like lead into an Ezra and Nehemiah movie. Be pretty good. We could also sell biblically accurate cookbooks out of Ezekiel, along with the biblically accurate angels. Daniel's great, but Daniel is the prequel movie that you have to release after everything's done because it's gonna spoil the rest of the movie, and even more so than like when Job. This is the one that will be like, yeah, this is what's gonna happen the rest of the show. So we have to like either wait or we just display it and then people figure it out, right? Because if you do it right, it's just so subtly foreshadowing that then later it's like, oh yeah, of course Daniel said that. Oh yeah, obviously. Everyone knows the cool stories like, oh, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Oh, Daniel in the lion's den. That's cool. And then the second half of Daniel happens, and nobody remembers how much of a trip it is. But it's all about prophecy, and it was about what will happen in the later days. I still think it would make a good movie. So. You got a great movie there about Daniel's life and his friends and all of their misadventures. Okay, then we get into the minor prophets. This is where people would lose hope. But this is where I find a lot of fun cameos and overlapping interweaving stories that really help you to understand what was going on at the time. All the minor prophets probably like get one episode of a TV show, or they are in part of other TV shows along the way. And I'll talk about like where they go in the timeline. But Hosea, it will be hard to put to the screen. Basically, Hosea marries a prostitute and she cheats on him. And then he buys her back from slavery. And it's a very great allegory about how God buys us back from sin. And, you know, it's a great gospel message, but it would be a hard movie to film. Again, not a, you know, family friendly content, but a great message nonetheless. Joel is another book that has a lot of foreshadowing for the future. Probably doesn't cameo really with anyone else. He kind of is his own dude. But he can be there, and maybe, you know, in the midst of some of these kingly episodes, you have an episode about Joel. Amos is a farmer who becomes a preacher, and I actually would really watch that. It's got like Great Awakening vibes, honestly, like Sheffy. Like if you've ever watched Sheffy, that's kind of what Amos is. Obadiah, my only note here is that one chapter is one episode, so he would just be one episode. Jonah. Okay, so Jonah might get his own season. We'd have to go pretty dark with Jonah just to distance ourselves from the VeggieTale version, just so everyone knows, like, this is a gritty retelling of Jonah. It would be fun if, and I'll mention this in Nahum. It would be fun if like the last episode of a Jonah series was just Nahum and preaching about Nineveh actually finally being destroyed, because then it's like, wait, what was it all for then if Jonah did that? So it kind of recontextualizes all of Jonah. Micah highlights an issue which he's contemporaries with Hezekiah and Isaiah. So it's like, again, we're skipping back and forth in the timeline, but that's okay because we could fit him in earlier. So like with a Hezekiah movie, you could have Micah be there and Isaiah kind of mix in. I do also kind of appreciate that it's like, you know, it's like a Star Wars Visions. It's like we have an episode and it's like, this is about Micah, you know, and remember Hezekiah, he was here and Micah was here at the same time and they were doing stuff, and no, you know, no one's confused and everybody understands, right? Perfect. I already said Nahum would be the final episode of a Jonah show to recontextualize all of Jonah. Yeah. Habakkuk is probably set during some of the final episodes of Chronicles, just like right before the Babylonian invasion. I like Habakkuk because it really displays the idea of like, why are you punishing the people of God with a foreign people? And Habakkuk kind of really explains that, you know, because of your sin, because of different things, yada yada. So it can be hard to hear that, but it's the word of the Lord. Zephaniah, he fits better into a film about Josiah. So Josiah, the young king, becomes king of Israel. Zephaniah is there, so he fits in really well right there. Good B plot for that film. Haggai is a prologue for Ezra, so it kind of sets up why the people of God should be excited about building God's house. So it can be, you know, like tee off Ezra really well, or be part of that movie. Zechariah, again, set up for later parts of the Old Testament. Good background for spiritual battles going on in Israel at the time during the divided kingdom. Malachi is going to be the last thing we see before the show takes like 4-year vacation to mirror the 400 years of silence from heaven. Just so it's crystal clear. It's like, we're going to not show any new books or movies, shows, anything while after Malachi, just so you understand, like, this is what the people of Israel were going through. They didn't know what was going to happen next. And then, boom, we're in the New Testament. Okay, so New Testament starts off real strong with the Gospels. So the 4 Gospel accounts could be combined into several films, or they could, like, all be their own version of the gospel films, and it's like, this is, you know, Matthew is like, this is how it happened, and then Mark is like, no, this is how it actually happened. The problem with that is they kind of just all agree. I know that there are quote unquote discrepancies, but that would be a good option to make one combined set of movies, like a trilogy, and then interpret the different things that happen and then show how they weren't discrepancies and actually those things fit together really well. Again, okay, so the same actor who plays God, the Christophanies that show up in the Old Testament, gets to play Jesus now, and so it's very super clear that it's clear that Jesus is God, and that every appearance of God in the Old Testament has been Christ, which is actually what we can infer from some of the Apostle Paul's writings later, to show that, like, no, Christ is the image of the invisible God, and no one has seen the Father, but we've seen Christ. And so it's like, no, Christ has been here the whole time, which is then again kind of reiterated on the road to Emmaus. And I'll talk about the road to Emmaus at the end, because that's kind of the frame that I'd like to talk about with this whole MCU or BCU. Probably takes several movies to make the whole story. For the book of Mark, we make sure that we depict all of the last chapter, and we make all of the right people mad with that. Luke is great because then he has a sequel in Acts, so it's like Luke, and then he can show up later in Acts and be like, whoa, I'm here, hey. John, okay, so Apostle John winks at the camera as many times as possible, like Jim from The Office. He's just always like, Whenever he's interacting with Peter, he annoys Peter. Peter is like acting like Dwight. Realize that John is Jim and Peter is Dwight. It's like the same dynamic. Just so we can have some fun with John. Let's get to Acts. We have an entire show dedicated solely to the premise that the main villain of season 1 becomes the protagonist of like the next 17 seasons. So Saul will be persecuting the Christians through season 1, and then in maybe the end of season 1 or maybe the start of season 2, he has a change of heart and gets saved, and then goes through this whole process of becoming an apostle Paul instead of Saul the persecutor. And then we go off with Saul or Paul the rest of the series, and there can be. This is where it's going to be very, very strong, because I think lots of the stuff that happens in Acts really shows what happened in the early church and how it developed and how it changed from Israel, the nation, to the church as the body of Christ. And that the mystery is finally revealed. Like, oh, this is what we're doing now. And that can be, I think, really, really fun. Also, I have another note here that says we have to get all the cool actors to play cameos for the Romans. So I guess my point there was like every centurion is supposed to be like Arnold Schwarzenegger or something, and like, oh, hey, it's that guy. But Acts is perfect because it leads right into all of the letters. So first we have Romans. Paul's first letter, and then Paul's letters I think will work better as like read or recited throughout the Acts show, like as he writes them, or maybe like as he preaches to that church. Then it's like, here's the letter to the Romans. Basically, I want them to act like Optimus Prime monologues from Transformers. Again, at the end of the chapter, as he finishes, it'll play Linkin Park. 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, same thing. We're just doing that the whole time. Special note on Galatians, we take a whole special episode to explain replacement theology, but we shake our head the whole time so everyone knows that we don't agree. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, similar. We just have them recited or written during an Acts episode. 1 Thessalonians is really fun because this one is like he casually mentions the rapture, and then for all of 2 Thessalonians he has to explain that to them because they were like, wait, what's that? So that can be like a fun, maybe another April Fool's episode. 1 Timothy, that's a simple letter to Timothy. Great. 2 Timothy is like the most profound father and son ministry relationship you've ever read, and probably will be the end to close out the Acts show, because it just brings together a lot of character arcs that we've seen. Paul and Barnabas, and Paul and John Mark, and then Paul and Timothy, obviously. Just all these different things kind of dovetailing finally at the end as Paul's ministry and his life comes to an end, and then it kind of passes on to the next generation. And then we can feel like, as a church, they're like, oh, it's being passed down to us. Good. That's why we're doing this. Titus probably would come before the Timothys. Philemon is probably a great episode on its own by itself, because it's got a great story, and it's a great anti-slavery message about, God has set us free, and, you owe everything to him, but we should serve our masters really well, but, we owe everything to the Lord, and we should be the bondservants of the Lord. We'll make Onesimus white just to make it extra confusing. Okay, Hebrews, probably its own episode of an Acts show. It's going to explain our Christian heritage, right? Why we look at Christ, kind of why he's the priest after the order of Melchizedek. I want it to be very strongly implied that Timothy is the author, because I think that's very cinematic, as far as Paul trained Timothy, and then finally Timothy writes a letter in the style of Paul, which is why everyone thinks it's a Pauline letter. We don't really know, but it's probably Paul, but maybe it's Timothy. Anyway, I'm taking liberties because it's my cinematic universe, I guess. Okay, so James is great because we'll say that James is Jesus's, biological brother, and every Catholic will stop watching at that point. But honestly, they probably stopped watching a little while ago. First and Second Peter, this is just Peter sitting around having flashbacks of when he did something completely stupid. So it's and then he writes don't do that. John, okay, First, Second, Third John. It's the same as Peter, actually, John having flashbacks, but John looks at the camera with the Ryan Gosling face, all the time. Also, John is played by Ryan Gosling, so that makes it even better. Jude says some of the most baller stuff ever, and he does not explain. He is literally the Chad, walks into a room, says something, refuses to elaborate, and then ends. And that's the end of the series. Then we have the finale. So all these 17 phases of Bible movies / TV shows that we've had, we come to Revelation. I just discussed how John is played by the preeminent Ryan Gosling. So we get him to reprise his role in Revelation as John, but he's very old. By the time these movies get made, he will probably be canonically 91, like he actually is. So he's just chilling on Patmos, and then Jesus appears. The first act is just talking about the churches in Asia Minor. So it plays out kind of like the book of Acts. He's just writing letters to the churches in Asia Minor. It's great. We love that there's churches in Asia Minor because it shows that the gospel is spreading everywhere. They just, discuss the whole gospel, what's happened so far in the series, how it's going, right? This is where I wanted to say really quickly, I would probably do a frame story for most of the Bible, this MCU, because as we're coming to the end, I want to hit this really importantly. We have Christ on the road to Emmaus. He's not revealed himself to, the two followers who are walking down the road. They're walking down the road discussing what's happened. Supposedly, Christ, who they've followed, has been resurrected. They can't believe it. And they're just walking down the road to the next town. Well, then Christ comes with them. And he asks about what they're discussing. This is the opening of the first movie. And it's so you start to get this interesting dynamic of okay, this is happening. You don't believe this? And, the mystery person starts to explain stuff. And the scripture is really great here because it says he begins to, explain to them, beginning at Moses, all of the scriptures concerning himself. And so that's where, in the road to Emmaus, we flash back into this biblical cinematic universe. and start to trace it like all the way through. And then we get to the Gospels where it all comes together. And that's when the frame pulls out and we go back to the road to Emmaus. And we say, Christ finally reveals himself to the two followers. And they're like, oh, of course. Like, did our hearts not burn with us when he was there explaining to us? And they realize that it's Christ and he's explained everything to them. And then that's where the Gospels kind of come to a close. And then we can have Acts and all of these letters that kind of form the final phase of this BCU, and explain, like, the mystery is explained now, like the gospel. Christ has come to save us, to redeem us from sin, and now he's creating a church that he's washing to be white as snow. And then all of that ends and we come to Revelation, and it's the final act of everything, and everything's going to finally be wrapped up, right? So the first half, like I just said, like Acts, writing the churches are growing, the gospel's going out. Second act happens, and it's like a Studio Ghibli, like LSD flashback trip that no one knows what's happening. All of these images of future prophecy events, elders, beasts, angels, vials, things are happening. We're like, what the wow? And it's like, if you paid attention through the whole runtime, maybe you're like, oh, I understand. That is actually that thing. It's happening. Whoa. All these cameos. You're like, no, that guy, he did that thing. Whoa, Melchizedek, Elijah, Elisha. Whoa. And then final act, it's all said and done. We go back to Patmos. It's like Ryan Gosling's like, whoa, that was crazy. And Jesus is like, okay, I'm coming at some point. And Ryan Gosling gets to turn to the camera and say, surely come quickly, Lord Jesus.